What do you do when people can't find anything wrong with your work, so they decide to make your faithfulness illegal? Daniel has now survived the fall of Babylon. He went to bed serving Belshazzar, and he woke up serving Darius the Mede. Now, most people would lay low after regime change. They would keep their head down and try not to attract attention. Daniel does the opposite. He is so excellent that the new king plans to set him over the entire kingdom. And that's when his colleagues decide, if we can't outperform him, we'll outlaw him. Daniel 6 is the story everyone knows about the lion's den, but it's not primarily about lions. It's about what happens when your spiritual practices become your political liability, and why consistency matters more than survival. Today, we're going to see how Daniel's unchanging prayer life both endangered him and defined him. To understand the trap they set, we need to understand Daniel's position in the new empire. So again, there's this transition happening. Babylon fell overnight in chapter 5. The Medo-Persian Empire now controls the entire world. Darius the Mede remains historically debated. This may be another name for Cyrus, or perhaps a governor that Cyrus appointed, possibly a man named Gubaru, or maybe it's Cyaxares II, mentioned by Xenophon. We don't really know. What's clear is Daniel, who's now in his 80s, is transitioning seamlessly into the new administration. Now, he served Nebuchadnezzar, he survived Belshazzar, and now he serves Darius. That's 3 regimes over roughly 66 years. Our story today, though, begins in Daniel chapter 6, verses 1 through 3, which I'll read from the Lexham English Bible. Join with me now. It pleased Darius, and he set up 120 satraps over the kingdom, that they were throughout the whole kingdom. And over them were 3 administrators, of whom Daniel was one, so that these satraps were giving account to them, and the king would not be suffering loss. Then Daniel began distinguishing himself above the administrators and the satraps, because an exceptional spirit was in him. And so the king planned to appoint him over the whole kingdom. Okay, there's a few key things to think about. Number one, there's 120 satraps. Now, you can think of these like provincial governors, and they were reporting to 3 administrators. Now, Daniel is one of these 3. This is essentially like a prime minister position of sorts, and he distinguishes himself. The Aramaic word there suggests that he was continually excelling or standing out, and there was an extraordinary spirit that was in him. Even the pagans could see there was something different about Daniel. The king plans to elevate him above everyone else, but his excellence creates enemies, and we all know how that works, right? Verse 4 tells us that they were seeking to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom. They audit his work, they investigate its decisions, they look for any hint of corruption, and they find nothing at all. So they changed the strategy. We will not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it against him in connection with the law of his God. And that's from verse 5. So they couldn't beat him professionally, but they decided they would weaponize his faithfulness. So that brings us to what I'm going to call the trap out of Daniel 6, verses 6 through 9. Join with me now and we'll read that. So the administrators and the satraps conspired with respect to the king. And so they said to him, Darius, O king, live forever. And all of the administrators of the kingdom and the prefects, the satraps, the counselors, and the governors took counsel and have agreed to establish an edict of the king and to enforce a decree that whoever will seek a prayer from any god or human except from you for up to 30 days will be thrown into the lion pit. Now, O king, establish the edict, and you must sign the document so that it cannot be changed, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked. So the king, Darius, signed the writing and the interdict. So the first observation here is the manipulation that's going on. It says that all the administrators have agreed. Well, that's a lie. Daniel didn't agree. They flattered Darius, making him the sole object of prayer for 30 days, which appeals to his ego. Again, I think we've probably all seen examples of something like this in our own lives. But then they evoke something called the law of the Medes and the Persians. Once signed, even the king himself cannot undo it. Now, Darius here doesn't realize he's being played. He signs this without consulting Daniel. This is a masterclass in political manipulation. Stroke the ego, create urgency, and lock in the decision before the questions arise. So Daniel's response to this is found in Daniel chapter 6, verse 10. Let's go read that now. Now, when Daniel realized that the document was signed, he went to his house. Now, he had windows in his upper room that were open toward Jerusalem, and 3 times daily he knelt on his knees and prayed and gave praise before God, just as he had been doing previously. So what did Daniel not do here? Well, number one, he didn't panic, and he didn't hide. He didn't pray silently in a closet where no one could see him. He didn't pause his practice for 30 days until the decree expired, and he didn't make a public spectacle either. He simply continued what he'd always done. What Daniel did do is just as important. It says here, just as he had been doing previously, and I think that's a key phrase. His windows were open toward Jerusalem, facing the temple, the place of God's presence. Now that follows Solomon's prayer in 1 Kings chapter 8, verses 46 through 50. 3 times daily, which was a Jewish practice rooted in Psalm 55:17. Kneeling, praying, giving thanks, even facing death, Daniel gives thanks. His response to the crisis was the same as his response to ordinary days: prayer. Now, you could call this the consistency principle. Daniel didn't become a prayer warrior because of the crisis. He was already a prayer warrior. The crisis just revealed it. His enemies knew his schedule. They knew where he prayed, when he prayed, and how he prayed. His spiritual life was so consistent, it was predictable, and that predictability became their weapon. In Daniel chapter 6, verses 11 through 14, we see the accusation and the king's distress. The conspirators catch Daniel praying, and that was exactly what they had planned on. They then report it to the king, reminding him of the unchangeable decree. Verse 14 there says the king is very distressed and works until sundown, trying to find a way to save Daniel. Darius likes him. He didn't see this coming, but the law can't be revoked. So then we have Darius's words at the lion's den. That comes from Daniel chapter 6, verse 16. Join with me. Then the king gave the command, and Daniel was brought in, and they threw him into the lion pit. The king said to Daniel, "Your God, whom you serve faithfully, may he rescue you." Which brings us to our next observation. The words, "whom you serve continually." Even this pagan king had noticed that Daniel served his God continually, not occasionally, not when convenient, and not when safe. Daniel's consistency had made an impression that outlasted the politics. Darius doesn't have faith, but he has seen Daniel's faith. And at this point in time, he is hoping it is real. So then we come to what I'll call the longest night, Daniel chapter 6, verses 18 through 20. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night in fasting, and no food was brought in before him, and his sleep fled from him. Then the king got up at daybreak, at first light, and he went in haste to the lion pit. And when he came near to the pit, he cried out to Daniel with a distressed voice. And the king spoke and said to Daniel, "O Daniel, servant of the living God, your God, whom you serve faithfully, was he able to rescue you from the lions?" Okay, this brings us to our next observation, and that's Darius's question. He says, "Has your God been able to rescue you?" Now, this is the same question that Nebuchadnezzar asked in chapter 3. Who is the God who will rescue you from my hands? But Darius asks with hope, not mockery. He has seen something in Daniel that makes him wonder if this God might actually be real. And then we have Daniel's answer from Daniel 6, verses 21 and 22. Then Daniel spoke to the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouth of the lions, and they did not hurt me, because before him I was found blameless, and also before you, O king, I have not done any wrong." So one thing that's interesting here, it says, "My God has sent his angel," some sort of divine intervention through a heavenly messenger. And this echoes the fourth figure that we found in the furnace, doesn't it? And of course, as I said then, a lot of people believe this was Jesus. It could have been a special angel sent, but I think there's a case that this angel was Jesus being represented in the Old Testament. The pattern, though, repeats itself. You have faithfulness, persecution, divine presence, and deliverance. God didn't prevent Daniel from entering the den, but he met him there. And then we have the vindication from Daniel 6, verses 23 and 24. Daniel he's lifted out of this lion's pit without a scratch. Why? Because he had trusted in his God. That's in verse 23. Now, then the accusers and their families are thrown into the den. The lions show that they were hungry. The conspirators' trap destroys them instead. All right, now we're going to read Daniel chapter 6, verse 25 through 27. Then Darius the king wrote to all the people, the nations, and the languages living in the whole earth, "May your prosperity become great. I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom people will be trembling and fearing before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God and endures forever, and his kingdom is one that will not be destroyed, and his dominion has no end. He is rescuing, delivering, and working signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth, for he has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." All right, the next observation I have is the testimony here brings some results. So, like Nebuchadnezzar before him, Darius issues a decree about Daniel's God, the living God. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion is forever. Daniel's faithfulness has once again made God visible to a pagan empire. One man's consistency in prayer leads to a royal proclamation about God's eternal kingdom. So what's the ambassador framework here? Well, Daniel 6 shows us an ambassador whose private disciplines become public witness. His prayer life wasn't designed for an audience, but it became his most powerful testimony. His consistency wasn't strategic, it was simply who he was. When the crisis came, he didn't have to decide who to be, he already knew. And there are three principles that come from Daniel's example that I think are important to us. Number one, consistency is more powerful than intensity. Daniel didn't pray heroically in the crisis, he prayed normally, just as he had been doing previously. His response to extraordinary pressure was ordinary faithfulness. We often think spiritual power comes from dramatic moments. Daniel shows us it comes from daily rhythms. The question isn't, would I pray if it meant the lion's den? The question is, am I praying now when it cost me nothing? Visible faithfulness will eventually be tested. Daniel's enemies could only attack him through his faithfulness because his faithfulness was visible. If Daniel had been a secret prayer, someone who prayed in private, a private believer with no observable practices, they'd have had nothing to weaponize. But visible faithfulness is vulnerable faithfulness, and that's okay. We're not called to hide our faith to protect ourselves. We're called to live it consistently and trust God with consequences. Your spiritual practices are forming you for moments you can't predict. Daniel didn't know when he started praying toward Jerusalem that one day it would put him in a lion's den, but those decades of practice formed a man who didn't flinch when the test came. The habits you're building today are shaping who you'll be in a crisis you can't yet see. The question for you is, what would your life reveal if someone investigated your spiritual practices? Now, in our modern lives, we're probably not going to face a law against prayer, but you might face a workplace culture where faith is mocked or a social circle where conviction is costly. And the temptation there is to dial back, to pray less visibly, to speak less clearly, to blend in more carefully. But Daniel shows another way, unchanged faithfulness regardless of circumstances, not obnoxious, not performative, just consistent. And that consistency is itself a witness. So, my closing thought for you, though, is this. Here's what strikes me about Daniel 6. When the decree was signed, Daniel had a choice. He could have prayed silently. He could have closed the windows. He could have paused for 30 days and resumed later. No one would have blamed him. But Daniel understood something. If he changed his practice because of pressure, he'd be worshiping the decree instead of God. His prayer wasn't about being seen by men, but it also wasn't about hiding from them. He simply continued doing what he had always done. And that consistency, that refusal to let circumstances dictate his faithfulness, is what made him Daniel. An 80-year-old man kneeling at an open window, giving thanks while his enemies watched. That's what formed faith looks like. So I want to leave you with this ambassador challenge this week. I want you to examine your spiritual practices with one question in mind. What am I doing now consistently that would still be there under pressure? Maybe it's daily scripture reading. Maybe it's prayer. Maybe it's Sabbath keeping or generosity or gathering with other believers. Whatever it is, do it this week with Daniel's posture, not performing for an audience, not hiding from critics, just being faithful, just as you have been doing previously. That's how ambassadors are formed in the ordinary days before the lion's den ever comes. I'm Steve Sanders. Until next time, reflect Him well and God bless.